Welcome back to my channel, where today we're going to dig into, is there a value difference between a PSA 1 and an SGC 1 when it comes to T206 Polar Bear Hall of Famers specifically. But before we begin, my name is Chris, otherwise known on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok as @CRT_sportscards. If you're new around here, welcome to my channel. I am currently building a 520 card T206 set that I'm currently documenting as well on Instagram. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you for coming back. But let's get into it for this video. This will be broken up into 6 different chapters, so feel free to skip around, hit that subscribe button so you can obviously take in the entire video. But number one, I'm going to talk about what does PSA and SGC define as a 1 grade. I'm also going to talk about why I love PSA and SGC 1s. More specifically here, I'm an SGC fan over a PSA fan, but that's more of a personal preference. We're also going to look at what are the quantity of Hall of Famers in a 1 grade, both on PSA and SGC. Then we'll look at some of the players that have a very, very high percentage of cards in a 1 grade. There's going to be some interesting numbers here for players that are based out of St. Louis. Remember, Polar Bear was made in Ohio, and St. Louis was the #1 team back then. We're also going to look at the overall market cap for SGC and PSA in Polar Bear terms. And then number 6, we will wrap this up and talk about what is at the end of the day, what is the value difference between SGC and PSA with Ty Cobb in the mix and also without Ty Cobb, because Ty Cobb is obviously a card or 2 cards that are going to skew this data in a significant way. But when you take a look at some of these numbers, some of the results are, in my opinion, very, very surprising. But let's start laying that groundwork right now. What does PSA and SGC consider a 1 on their grading scale? Looking specifically here at PSA, their wording states that a 1 will exhibit many of the same qualities as a 1.5, but the defects have advanced to such a serious stage that the eye appeal of the card has nearly vanished in its entirety. A poor card may be missing 1 or 2 small pieces, creasing, may contain extreme discoloration, dirtiness throughout that may make it difficult to identify the issue or content. Very, very descriptive around what a 1 is. And when you think about Polar Bear, one thing that's distinctive about Polar Bear is it was the only brand that was sold in loose tobacco. So you were going to find Polar Bear cards that have bits of tobacco still stuck on the card. And that is why these are some of the hardest cards to find in a very high grade, because they were not used as a stiffener or a support in the rolled cigarettes as in the other brands were. But now looking at SGC here, of how they classify the 1 grade as, this card usually exhibits many of these characteristics, right? Heavy print spots, creases, pen holes, color or focus imperfections, discoloration, surface scuffing or tears, rounded or fraying corners, pencil markings. Remember, SGC does not have qualifiers. PSA will grade a card with qualifiers, so with the pencil mark, they will mark it a PSA 1 MK. SGC does not have that designation. And then also with SGC here, you can also have pieces of the card missing, which will get at that 1 grade. So in large part here, when you look at what PSA says is a 1 and what SGC says is a 1, they're largely the same, if not absolutely equal on the understanding and grading of a 1 outside of the qualifiers that PSA uses. But now let's take a look at some of the PSA 1 cards. Some are actually in my collection, others are not. I just picked these images up from the Vintage Card Prices website. But looking specifically here at Johnny Evers, that 1 grade, that's definitely a 1 grade. You see that tobacco on the front left. You also have heavy creasing, very, very heavy wear on that card. Then of course you have another Evers missing some of the front of the card, significant paper loss, absolutely a 1 grade here. Moving our focus over to Addy Joss, very, very heavy creasing. That card has lived a wonderful and adventurous life, but absolutely a 1 graded, very deserving. Getting into a little bit better of a card here, we've got Mordecai Brown. You do see that staining on the bottom left. It is completely off-centered, but remember, we didn't talk about centering in 1 grades, but there is that creasing, though, on the top of his head up to the top of the card. Then, just a little bit different of a Mordecai Brown, more staining, more creases, very, very different looking one, but both of those cards are a 1 grade. Then we have some of the better looking cards. Both of these next two are actually in my collection. We have a Frank Chance batting 1 grade. The bottom of the card is torn a little bit up just right above Chicago, but overall very, very clean looking card, although the image is a little bit blurry due to the printing plates being off. And then one of my favorite ones in my collection, Nick Maddox. That is, in my opinion, a wonderful looking card, and that is the reason why I love SGC or PSA ones. You are going to find some absolute beater of cards. Cards that just got past that A grade for authentic, but then cards that'll never make 1.5 due to a smaller reason, maybe a pinhole, maybe a crease. But if you built a SGC 1 set in these cards and you were very picky, you were going to build an absolutely beautiful set. And that is also why I believe when you look at 1 grade specifically, it is the best way to look at value difference of PSA versus SGC. Now, when you look at the overall grading population of these two brands, what does it look like from a Hall of Fame perspective? And then what does it look like from a 1 grade perspective? There are player differences when it comes to percent of ones versus overall graded population, but some of these numbers are absolutely, in my opinion, shocking when I looked at the overall population. So looking specifically here at SGC, 2,748 Hall of Famers have been graded by SGC, with 660 being a 1 grade, 24%. Now, looking over at PSA, largely the same number, 2,754 graded cards, with 672 being a 1 grade. And shocking there, also 24% of the overall PSA Hall of Fame population report is of a 1 grade. Does that surprise you to see that similar results between PSA and SGC? Leave a comment below. I'm curious on your thoughts when you saw those numbers. So now that we know 24% of all of the Hall of Famers in both PSA and SGC are graded a 1, what 5 players in each brand represent the highest amount of 1s when you look at their entire graded population? Now, looking specifically here at SGC first, we have Joe Ironman McGinty. 34% of his SGC cards are graded a 1. Second, we have Cy Young. 32% of those Youngs are a 1. And then all tied at 31%, we have Christy Mathewson, Frank Home Run Baker, Sam Crawford, and then Walter Johnson. All of those are at 31%. Then taking a peek here at the PSA cards with the highest amount of 1s in their population, we have Roger Bresnahan. 38% of his cards are a 1 grade, followed by Joe Tinker at 31%, along with, again, Christy Mathewson and Sam Crawford. Huey Jennings, 2-hand showing, comes in 29%, and then Johnny Evers, 28%. And now seeing Bresnahan at 38% got me thinking about where do the other St. Louis players rank in condition, considering the intense focus around St. Louis players in Polar Bear. Remember, Ray Dimmitt and Bill O'Hara only found in Polar Bear with the St. Louis uniform on. But look at those numbers from SGC. 28%, 28%, 29%. Now, yes, it is only Vic Willis and Bresnahan, but it's still very interesting to see. And then on the PSA side, we have Vic Willis coming in at 19 and 17%. So a little bit under the average, but it was interesting to think maybe the kids back then in St. Louis treated these cards a little more aggressive, maybe showed them off a little bit more, and that is why those cards specifically may be in worse condition compared to the average at 24%. And now on the flip side, when you look at Hall of Famers with the least amount of ones in their population report, what are the top 3 in both SGC and PSA? Looking here now at the SGC cards, Zach Wheat leads the way. Just 10% of his cards are a 1 grade, just 3 copies. Then we have Jimmy Collins, 7 of his 52 are 13%. And then we have Jake Beckley, 7 of his 49 for 14% are of a 1 grade. Then as we shift our focus to PSA, we are looking at John McGraw, 5 of his 37 for 14%. Jake Beckley again, 17%. And then Vic Willis, 17% in PSA. So seeing Vic Willis there on the lower end does kind of refute my earlier point around, do the St. Louis players have a maybe more significant wear because of where they are? But it was interesting to see the significant difference on the SGC side versus PSA. But now how are we going to put all of this information together to figure out which brand of one is more valuable, or maybe they are the same? We'll find out here in a second. So what I did here was take a look at the latest pricing in vintage card prices and then compare it to the overall population when it comes to the 1 grades. And so we're going to break down SGC market cap by card and then compare it to PSA. And as I said at the beginning of the video, we're going to look at it with Ty Cobb, and then we're also going to look at it without Ty Cobb. So now here is that SGC list broken down by card. Starting from the very top, the most valuable card from a market cap perspective, it's no surprise here. Ty Cobb Portrait Red in SGC, $116,000. The average price right now for that card is $2,007. There are 43 known copies of one, so that is how I figured out $116,000. A couple of things to note on this chart, and they stand out like a sore thumb when you go all the way to the very bottom. Taking a look at VCP, Jake Beckley, John McGraw, and Zach Wheat do not have a registered sale on their website. And this website goes back to 2008 prior. So there is a lot of data on here. But it's also a great reminder. Just because a card has not sold on this website doesn't mean it hasn't changed hands overall. That Frank Chance 1 grade does not show a sale since 2008, and I bought mine in a what we would call a private sale a couple of years ago to complete my polar bear set. So this data, while it is largely accurate for the auction houses and the big websites, there of course is data that is always missed in every single pricing guide that is out there. But then you also take a look at the 4 bottom cards. Rube Marquardt, Huey Jennings, Frank Chance. None of those cards have had a 1 grade sale since 2018, 2017, and then as spoken about a second ago, 2008 for Frank Chance. But you can see as you go from top to bottom, Ty Cobb, Cy Young, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, not a real big surprise there when you think about the quality of player at the top of the list to the absolute bottom when you look at Hugh Duffy, Bresnahan, players like that. So that is the look at SGC. Now when we look at the PSA information, it is largely more complete than the SGC. Every card has a sale recorded, but there were more sales from many years ago that make the data just maybe a slightly bit more inaccurate. So taking a look here at the PSA numbers, we have, of course, leading the way again, Ty Cobb, but in this one, we have Ty Cobb Portrait Red at $143,000 with Bat Off Shoulder coming in at $114,000. Well, you see that red. There are 7 red figures on here with sales that have happened over 4 years ago on the public market. So John McGraw, the last sale 2011. We know $35 is not an accurate value, but that is the number that is in the guide at the moment. Jake Beckley, 50 bucks. Frank Chance batting, $75. That is nowhere near what that card is worth because that card is very rare compared to his portrait variation. You're also looking at Joe Kelly, Hugh Duffy, Huey Jennings, and then interesting one up there was Nap Lajoie with bat. That was surprising to see, not a registered PSA 1 sale since 2015. But when you take a look at all of these numbers, when you add all of them up, including the Ty Cobb from SGC and PSA, where do the numbers fall for these brands? So when we look at SGC, when we add up all of those Hall of Famers, the total market cap right now, considering 3 cards have not sold, we're looking at $363,000. When you look at PSA, even though there are several cards that have not sold in many, many years in a public fashion, you are looking at $432,000. But those numbers are wildly skewed because of the expense of Ty Cobb. When you remove the Ty Cobb cards from both market caps, SGC, you're looking at $171,000. In PSA, you're looking at $174,000. But now here is a number that surprised me the most at the end of this exercise. When you remove the graded amount of Ty Cobbs, both from the SGC total and the PSA total, you are left with the exact same amount of graded Hall of Famers in SGC and PSA, 579. I never thought for a second we would have the exact same amount of non-Ty Cobb Hall of Famers in both SGC and PSA. But when you do the math, and we're going to go back in and add Ty Cobb here, but this is why this number is extremely skewed. On the SGC market cap, the 2 Ty Cobb cards represent 50% of the entire value of SGC Hall of Famers. And on the PSA side of things, it is 40%. So those two values completely skew the data. But at the surface level, SGC with Ty Cobb, the average value is $551. PSA outpaces it at $643. So absolutely right there, PSA wins over SGC, but the data needs to be looked at in a better, more finite way. So let's now remove Ty Cobb from the equation. From an SGC perspective, you were looking at an average value of $297 on PSA, even though several of those values are very, very older, maybe non-existent in today's market. You're looking at $302 per PSA 1. But I would make the strong argument right now that because the PSA data, or because the SGC data is missing 3 card sales, when you mix those actual figures in, an SGC 1 is more valuable than a PSA 1. But then on the flip side, when you go back to that PSA data, with 7 figures being outdated, with data that is over 4 years old, if you have current data for those 7 cards, does that make the PSA brand more valuable than SGC? I know just from a visual perspective, I prefer SGC over PSA, but to really be honest here, when you look at the numbers, sans Ty Cobb, those 2 brands at the 1 level are right now statistically the exact same value. But I'm really curious of your thoughts. When you started watching this video, did you think the values would be wildly different in SGC versus PSA? Did you think they'd be closer? And then at the end, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer PSA or do you prefer SGC? If you liked the video as well, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. And as well, continue to hit that subscribe button so you are notified when my next T206 video gets posted.